that means that they can make better design decisions for themselves, for their customers, and for their businesses. So we get asked quite a lot at WGSN how we forecast the trends. How do we do it? How do we predict what's coming next? So this is just a little bit of insight into what we do. And it really does take a lot. Like I said, we have 250 different people. We have offices in 14 different countries. So it takes a lot of research. When we talk about trends, we're not just talking about what people are wearing. We're talking about things like society, so social identifiers, consumer attitudes, politics, economics. We're looking at creativity, so media, arts, culture, fashion, product design. And then we're looking at lifestyle shifts as well. So things like what's happening in culture, what's happening with consumer behaviours, how are people spending their time, what are their hobbies, what's retail doing, what's happening in technology. So we look at all of these different kind of things around the world. We also track lots of retail analytics, catwalk analytics, and do a lot of online and offline research. So we do all of this research and analyse this information, and then it's our job as trend forecasters to identify and connect the trends. We then challenge assumptions, we verify them globally, and then we map out the trend's lifespan. So once we have all of this information, what we can do is start to put together different types of forecasts. So we can forecast on different timelines from 10 years out, the trends like, are we going to live on Mars, to things that are happening right now. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about autumn-winter 1920 for women's wear. So we're going to look about a year ahead of where we are now, and the next season on from what you'll be seeing at the shows here over the next few days. So WGSN is the leading... sorry, I went backwards. Did I go backwards? There we go. Thank you. I should use this. There we go. So we're going to start with our big ideas. So WGSN, when we forecast our trends, we always identify big ideas that are going to impact each category for the next season. So these are the big kind of 5 points that are driving the industry. So these ideas are in particular relation to the women's wear industry. So the first big idea that's really impacting what we're seeing happening next is around collaborations and collaborating creatively. So collaborations are well known as a way to gain exposure for emerging brands and for providing lots of fresh talent and fresh ideas for larger brands. But consumers now expect a lot more from their brand partnerships, and they're looking for much more kind of creativity in these collaborations. So co-branded collaborations are a great way, like I said, to introduce new talent, but they may start to lose a little bit of steam as a marketing tool, so they're going to lose a little bit of that hype. So new creative partnerships are here to stay, and they're much more kind of interesting and unexpected, and consumers are really looking for more unusual collaborations. For example, Calvin Klein partnered up with Amazon, and Amazon actually provided them with lots of technology to allow them to interact with their customers in store. So it gave them lots of new tech algorithms. So this isn't your typical kind of brand collaborations where you see them creating products together in an obvious way, but it shows that the industry is starting to change, and it shows that more kind of data and understanding and strategy is being incorporated into design. So the fashion industry is starting to accept that consumers have become equal to the design talent, and you really have to understand what they want to be able to, and involve them in the creative process more. The next idea is being open-minded. So we are living in a much more inclusive world, and as the concept of inclusivity starts to expand and go further, minorities are really becoming the majorities, and consumer demographics are really shifting. So realising the potential of these previously underserved demographics means that there needs to be much more inclusive design, and there needs to be more kind of strategic targeting for these audience. So a great example of this is Islam. So Islam is the only religion that's growing faster than the world's population, and it will be the world's largest in the world by 2070. So that type of consumer has different needs from their products, from the design of their clothing. So modest fashion is really coming to the fore, and it's required not just by kind of people with religious beliefs. It's required by a range of different women. So this is encouraging the need for diversity in the fashion industry. Modest wear, you'll have started to see it kind of permeate the high end to the high street. Nike have released kind of modest wear, active wear, and it should be offered as not as an addition. It should be incorporated into design. So to make things feel much more inclusive, they need to be offered in a kind of free and kind of easy way. So they're not an addition to a range, they're as part of a range. Also with this, think about influencers and people that can help your brand feel much more relatable and inclusive as well. So we're seeing an increase in diversity in models, in the influencers that brands choose to partner up with, because it helps in becoming much more open-minded. The third idea is about vintage. So second-hand retail is having a really interesting moment, and it is now considered an entry point for millennials and for Gen Z. So your kind of younger consumers are really looking for these kind of second-hand resale markets and vintage influences. So the resurgence of the resale market gives new interest for women who already have and kind of understand the sentimentality and the authenticity of vintage wear. But we're also seeing lots of new e-commerce strategies giving new structures to vintage shopping and making it much more accessible than it's ever been before. Big brands, so Farfetch, the big online retailer, they now have their own vintage section, and they said that people are asking for more and more vintage, and they're asking it from 15 years ago and earlier. So this indicates that there's a new approach to vintage buying, and it's about you can buy it online just as easily as you can buy anything else, but it's also about acknowledging that the definition of vintage is evolving into and it now includes much more recent years. So before, vintage used to have a kind of longer time away from us. High fashion brands are continuing to use their heritage much more to create contemporary looks. So they're using their kind of tradition, their heritage, and displaying that in parallel with kind of new items and new designs. So they're balancing out kind of vintage pieces and new ideas together. And as kind of fashion speeds up and the kind of influences that we use are used up much quicker, vintage is becoming a real source of renewed inspiration. So rather than just copying the catwalks, it's going to be about kind of leveraging vintage or vintage-inspired looks. I think I can hear them still talking. Okay. So the next idea is around sustainability. So I'm sure you've all heard a lot about sustainability. It's something that we talk a lot about at WGSN at the moment and have done for a few years now. Because sustainability is such a big growing demand from consumers. And it can really help to signify authenticity and can increase a brand's loyalty, as well as creating a point of differentiation and creating deeper meaning with their consumers. Millennials in particular expect brands to be ethically active, and they also expect brands to help them do better, so to give them options where they can feel like they are acting sustainably. 66% of global millennials are actually willing to spend more on sustainable items and sustainable brands, so it is a real shift in the way that people are spending their money. So brands must kind of balance out the adoption of sustainable business practices with their trend-led image, and this is why it's so difficult for a lot of people to use. Oh, I can hear myself. So Gucci are a good example of this. They announced a fur-free policy, which is good for business, and it doesn't really impact their sales too much because the demand for fur within their market wasn't too high. But sustainability is such a big topic, and newness really drives the fashion industry. So blending these two parts can be very difficult. Blending key seasonal items with your kind of perennial sustainable collections is a great way to ensure growth and provide a lot of kind of positive attention. Mango are a very good example of this. Their committed collection sells alongside their main range, so it offers customers the choice to really easily buy into sustainability. It gives them that message across that they're doing well. It's improving their supply chain, but more than that, it's allowing their customers to do better. So a lot of what brands need to do is give customers the option for them to do better. Okay, so the last kind of big idea that's driving the autumn-winter 1920 trends is function meets form. So technology is making our lives so much easier, so much more convenient, and Asia and China in particular is really making major advances in tech that make things much more convenient. So there are apps now, I don't know if anyone uses them, where you can get people to stand in queue for you and wait for your items. You can scan QR codes to use the subway. So these tech innovations are really pushing consumers around the world, actually, towards much more mobile commerce and m-commerce. So in turn, that drives them towards much more kind of performance materials. Because as our lives become much more kind of multifaceted and seamless, our clothes also need to do that for us as well. So there's a need for a real utility function. This is particularly relevant in Asia at the moment, and we can already see trends evolving from very feminine to much more kind of sports and street influenced. But we're also seeing new tech elements being incorporated into designs, materials that can alter your temperature or connect you to your devices. So with this, simplicity is really key and functionality is a must. And consumers, as we move forward, will demand more from the garments that they're wearing. It can't just look good. It also has to help them live their life in a much easier way. So those are the 5 kind of like action points to think about. These are really big picture. They're not particularly, they're not giving you any design direction, but they're ideas to consider as we move forward. So tech and data need to be incorporated into fashion systems as a way to connect with your consumer. Inclusivity is evolving from a trend to a reality. So think about catering to much more diverse groups of people and becoming much more inclusive. Look to your archives or to vintage inspiration to reinvigorate your product offering and make it more special. So it gives customers something unique. Sustainability, so it's not about fitting in with a criteria, it's about being part of a bigger movement and working together to design sustainably rather than just it being a trend. People are really looking to you to design products that allow them to live better. And then clothing must go beyond just aesthetics, so it must match up to the needs of their high-speed lifestyles. So I think I'll give them a chance to catch up. So those are the big ideas. So these are the overarching messages that kind of feed through autumn-winter 1920. And from those, we have 3 macro trends that come out of these big ideas. So we have one called freestyle, one called purposeful, and one called light magic. And I'm going to start with freestyle today. So freestyle is the first trend, and it's a really youthful feeling direction, but it does have a very grown-up edge. So this is driven by kind of extreme forms of self-expression and identity emerging. And the fact that if consumers can't find a box that fits them, they will just create one that does. And it is because we have a much more inclusive view of the past, of the present, and of the future. So our personal identities will really be freed. People can be whoever they want to be, and all styles will really be celebrated. So it's about the need to be inclusive, to be individual, and to be expressive. This trend definitely evolves from Spring/Summer 19, and it moves from kind of quite bold, brash statements into slightly more sophisticated styles. So in this story, you'll see kind of sports influences sharing the same kind of platform as much more glamorous materials and details. So the first way that we see that coming through is with this urban extravagance look. So as street style continues to be as important now as the influence of catwalks, we will see street style evolve in a more grown-up and glamorous way. So items like crop tops, like tracksuits, are fused with lots of luxurious embellishments and finishes for this look that is quite glamorous, but it's not too kind of garish or full-on. So what we're seeing is the use of really opulent and feminine fabrics like satins or velvets in unexpected ways that give you this real nice contrast between things that are pretty and things that are quite tough. Byzantine decoration. So freestyle does encompass an element of glamour to it, and this kind of Byzantine richness is what we see coming through in particular. So it's really about this very historic, aged yellow gold being an essential tone. And we've seen it used for accessories and footwear. We're seeing it as used for kind of really elaborate decoration within jewellery ranges as well. And we're seeing this heavy use of these kind of very ornate aged gold designs, but also a lot of kind of glass-like gem tones as well. And they really kind of enhance the opulent side of this trend. So tailoring is still continuing, so it's obviously got a lot of prominence right now, and it will continue through the next few seasons. And here we see it being kind of matched up with a lot of active influences and a lot of these kind of quite strong 80s looks. So it's about combining very kind of sharp suit jackets with sports styling. So we're seeing tailor jackets continue to be important moving forward and being worn with everything from kind of mini skirts and bras through to kind of trainers. So what's important here, the kind of move on for this style, is to keep things really sharp and to play on the contrast between formal and casual within the kind of styling of the item. We then have the checks. So checks have made a massive impact and a huge return thanks to more sartorial looks coming back through. And for autumn-winter 1920, we see them being recontextualised again in a much more casual way, being spliced and mismatched. A lot of your vintage or heritage references are really important here. Burberry's reinvention of its classic check is a really key reference for this kind of direction. And the checks, although they remain quite simple, the newness comes here in how they're used. So they're placed diagonally, they're mismatched, they're used on unexpected items like parkas or sportswear. And we see this across a range of categories, from kind of your classic tailoring items into more technical fabrics or knitwear. The puffa, so I don't need to say too much about this. The puffa has been a fixture in the market for a number of winter seasons. For autumn-winter 1920, it becomes a lot more playful. So it's about playing with colour, playing with pattern, using some of those check references again, florals, colour pop linings. It's kind of an anything goes. And it's just about things that kind of veer away from the traditional. So lots of quilting, quite exaggerated puffiness, lots of detachable details coming through here, just to give a little bit of a refresh for the staple item. So designs here, they are kind of about mixing different cultural signifiers together and highlighting the kind of fluidity and the inclusivity of global references. And it's about appreciating them rather than appropriating them. So it's about kind of using patterns, textures, colours all together. And what's interesting is to see them used in very kind of modern ways. So, for example, the bag here that uses traditional kind of handcrafted textiles in quite bold, linear adaptations. So that gives it a kind of newness, a modernness, and allows you to work with these multicultural references in quite a clean way. So colour blocking and mixed textures are really important to convey that sense of cultural collaboration. So the last kind of idea behind this trend is around novelty and joy. So it gives you a lot of kind of light relief and a lot of kind of just a sense of playfulness and a sense of fun. So what we're seeing are really quite surreal details and kitsch motifs that give you this high-low approach to materials, and it makes for very playful ranges. So these designs become quite kind of hero pieces within the freestyle trend. So colours and materials transition from quite summery palettes, and the items are very attention-grabbing. So whether that's like the Comme des Garçons teeth within the wallet, the elephant heel here, it's all about just a sense of joy and playfulness and kind of being quite kitschy about your designs. So looking at the colours for this palette, for this trend, freestyle, it's all about this kind of mixture of brightness and then more sophisticated mid-tones and neutrals. So the mid-tones here feel quite contemporary. So you've got these kind of, the red and brown on the edge there. You've got the marine blue, which is like that dark blue, and the Braeburn red. So quite sophisticated mid-tones. And then mixed with more opulent colours, kind of gem-like, glamorous colours, like the ripe berry, the kind of dark purple in the middle, the green here on the end. And then you've got your kind of bolder colours. So you've got the yellows, the oranges, that add a lot of kind of that youthful, kind of expressive part to the trend. So the bright accents really add a lot of energy here. The red flame and the kind of Sydney blue, that bright blue, are very, very important as highlight colours within this palette. So when we think about ways to work with these colours, although this first kind of combination is quite striking, it's more of a fluid colour story than an intense clash. So it's very sophisticated, but it's still got that youthful mix to it. So in here you've got the Alfonso yellow, the flame, and the Sydney blue. So really quite bright, almost primary tones that work really nicely with the richer, darker colours here. So these are almost like faux black, so they're very, very dark darks, and they just help to balance out these brighter colours and make them feel much more sophisticated. The reds, so we are seeing reds continue to be very prominent within autumn-winter 1920, but the colours that we see here become much more raw and earth-like. So you've got the Braeburn red, the flame, the reddened brown, which is that kind of red-brown colour towards the bottom, and then the lighter colours, so these kind of the plaster and the pink alabaster that are used in a kind of clashing yet balanced effect. So it's a really nice way to consider working with all the red tones. The yellow that you see towards the bottom just adds a little bit of heat and vitality in here, but it's really nice. Again, it feels quite youthful, but also quite sophisticated at the same time, and slightly darker than some of the other combinations within this. So despite this palette, when you look at it as a whole, it feels very bright, very vivid, and there's a lot of emphasis on the brights this season. But the neutrals here offer a nice kind of discrete focus, so a nice alternative. So what we're seeing here are much more kind of interesting neutral shades. So they're all kind of tinged with either the pinks or the greens, so they add a lot of depth to the neutral colours. But you've got the blonde wood, the pink alabaster, the plaster, and the cashew, all being kind of overlaid to create quite sophisticated looks. Again, this trend is a lot about this kind of mix between sophistication and kind of playfulness and streetwear. So these tones here work really nicely on very detailed materials or delicate or these kind of sheer tones as well. And the last part for freestyle is the brighter colours. So here you've got all of the brights, really. You've got the flame, the wildfire, the Alfonso yellow towards the top there. And they mix with the much cooler, darker colours of the red and brown and the ripe berry. So it's important here to note this orb green towards the bottom, because that gives them an almost digital quality. So it takes these traditionally quite warm, bright colours into the future and makes it feel much fresher, much newer. And these kind of daring combinations are equally as applicable to evening wear or more glamorous looks as they are to streetwear. So the same colours can be used, but the focus will be on the application, or if you include metallic finishes or details, it'll make it feel much more dressed up. So this is a very versatile colour palette. Okay. So the second trend is purposeful. So purposeful is about the fact that we are now in a world that is very much kind of saturated by stuff. We have a lot of stuff. And purposeful pushes back to a slower pace of life, and designs that are kind of celebrating craft and celebrating longevity. So the demand for transparency will escalate as we move forward, and nourishment will be a real key concept for design and for tech. So people will want to buy into things that either do good for their minds, their bodies, their lifestyles, the environment. So within this trend, it's very much about quality of material and sustainable options and sustainable systems. So what we see here is a lot of craftsmanship, a lot of kind of vintage references and heritage references, because they talk to this kind of longevity and seasonless appeal. And designs focus much more on timeless styles and classic materials. So things like classic knits come back through, and these kind of retro knits will be a bit of a comeback for women and young women. And it offers a really easy way to create quite sophisticated but studious looks. So this direction works best for fitted sweaters, for tank tops, for cardigans, focusing, again, V-necks coming back through quite strongly here. What's important to note on this part, on this kind of trend, is that designs are very pared down. So they're not too kitschy or too kind of obvious. It's just about the detail in here, whether that's the material, whether it's the use of kind of mid-century geometrics, whether it's kind of the tipping on the edges. It's these kind of more subtle retro influences. And again, another very simple direction. So this trend is very much about kind of, it's the most minimal of all the stories. So the simple sweater becomes key. It becomes a real statement layering piece. And the emphasis here is on the use of luxurious materials, really high quality materials, and these really rich, lovely colours. So designs are kept very, very simple. And it is more about these kind of quality yarns or nuanced mid-tones coming through. They're an interesting way to layer things up. You can add and think about much more tactile finishes, whether it's ribbing details or these kind of roll-like finishes around the edge. So it's just about adding extra quality to very kind of simple, basic pieces. And then I love this one. So again, there's an importance of tailoring coming through, and oversized shapes and soft fabrics have this real casual appeal in this story. So it's much more kind of 90s Donna Karan than it is kind of full-on 80s power dressing. So this is the continuation of tailoring, but not quite as we know it. It's much more about this kind of big, easy look. So oversized silhouettes become really, really key here. And the focus, you can see, is much more on softness rather than on structure. It's not about kind of obvious shoulder pads or really clean-cut lines. It's about this kind of lived-in feel. So materials, again, really important to get this across. And within here, we're seeing lots of these kind of washed and rumpled finishes. So checks and stripes that are referenced are kind of much more within they're almost like pajama-like checks. And it's just got this sense of ease to it and this effortlessness. And then again, a little bit more around volume here. So in spite of lots of the kind of clear vintage references that come through in Purposeful, there's a more kind of up-to-date reflection on volume in design. So very kind of familiar leather goods, soft accessories, have quite a soft and full appearance, thanks to lots of gathering, lots of tucking, and almost quite blown up silhouettes. So this casual look, it also filters through into kind of cold weather or sports lifestyle products, and it can be applied in lots of different ways. So we see really beautiful kind of soft, sumptuous leathers. We can see this kind of quilted detail on the footwear here, and it can move through into kind of nylons as well. So very kind of versatile, but it's about this softness and ease of volume in products. And then the functional utility. So like I mentioned at the start, utility and function is really driving the industry forward. And this references very kind of classic workwear items. So consumers are looking for designs that last a long time and last a lifetime, not just a season. So this story is about classic items that can be styled up or styled down. So whether you think about this as overalls or jackets and cargo pants, which we're already starting to see gain a little bit traction on the streets, it's about referencing kind of the past. So using heritage fabrics becomes important here. Things like drills, canvases, denims, twills, anything with an almost kind of raw or stiff look will give you that kind of more traditional workwear, but you can think about reinventing these in softer treatments and wash treatments for something much more kind of soft and comfortable. And as I mentioned at the start, there is a real resurgence of heritage and vintage, and you'll see already the kind of logo mania that's happening out there from the 2000s is kind of running in line with this growth of vintage looks. So as I mentioned at the start, levering vintage is key, and levering these vintage references is key. So what we're seeing is people experiment with their bestsellers from the archives. We're seeing kind of very heavily branded goods, signature patterns or materials coming back through and being reintroduced into collections, and maybe more in unusual applications or unusual product areas. So customized brand favorites and the emergence of these kind of new signature styles tap into Purposeful's need for kind of timeless designs. And the last bit here is around, so Purposeful is the least embellished trend of this season. It is the most minimal that we have, and it sees a lot of these very kind of soft, minimalist silhouettes come through, and they really replace a lot of the kind of excessive decorations that we see in the other trends. So the designs that we see here are very playful, they're quite irregular, but they're still very clean. It's about this kind of, I don't know what's the word, like elegantly off-kilter. So things still look very grown up, but they have this element of play running through them. So the bags here are a really great example. So very structured, clean, minimalist silhouette, but with this kind of playful curve on the outer, which makes it feel much more fun and a little bit more whimsical. And it creates a much more kind of directional look in a very pared down collection. So very simple colorways, simple materials, just being given a little bit of a twist and a little bit of this kind of soft minimalist look. So the color palette that you see for Purposeful, it has this very kind of nostalgic quality to it. It's very comfortable and kind of comforting. And what you see here as the kind of richness is essential. So it is a very autumnal, transseasonal story, very much inspired by mid-century design. So it automatically has this kind of vintage feel to it and this kind of heritage element. A couple of important colours here are the pine cone, which is this brown here, and the black coffee, which is a really, really dark, it looks darker on my screen, a very, very almost black brown, and they almost work together as a kind of capsule palette. You've then got this kind of lemon yellow, this kind of Williams yellow, and the butternut as the bright highlights within this purposeful story. And they're just kind of like these toned down brights that work really nicely into an autumn season. So there's still a lot of brightness within this palette, despite the fact it is an autumn-winter season. Your earthy, worn-out colours are also key. They have this kind of organic retro quality to them. So things like the cherry wood, the soft moss, and the marshland green. So they very much call back to these kind of mid-century or retro qualities. And then this blue here on the end, the Bowie blue, it kind of brightens up some of these vintage references. It has a much more contemporary feel than a lot of the other colours, and it works really nicely for a much more kind of cleaned up aesthetic, particularly if you work it with the silver ash that runs alongside. There are also some metallics in here, so you can see the metallics aren't your traditional kind of shiny silvers and golds. You've got these kind of coloured metallics that just can add a little bit of depth and sophistication. Okay, so this is an interesting colour palette because it's very nostalgic and it almost feels quite masculine for a women's wear combination. So what you see here is the pine cone, which is the brown, and the black coffee working alongside that blue that I mentioned, that Bowie blue. Towards the bottom then, you've got some brighter colour. You've got the kind of Williams yellow, and then that kind of cherry pop and cherry wood colours that give you a kind of retro feel, but still feel very, very kind of classic. You can see that this story uses much more muted colours, and it almost has this kind of worn down effect, which gives everything that vintage feel automatically. So it's nice to see this kind of stripped down, pared back version of these brights coming through. I love this one. So this is a nice kind of harmony of the warm and the cool coming together. It feels very kind of vintage, but it's got this nice warmth to it. What's important here is that marshland green, so the kind of darker green that you see towards the bottom, really complements the soft moss, and it really kind of is a very sophisticated darker tone for the season. And then you've got that butternut squash working really well with the pine cone at the top, so it feels very grown up, very refined. Again, the pine cone is a great way to balance out some of that kind of brightness that the butternut has. And this mix of colours is really lovely because it works for both casual and formal wear and really emphasises the quality or the texture of the fabrics. So again, this trend is so much about quality and kind of tactility, and these colours really work well with those beautiful kind of soft materials. Here you've got the warm tones that reflect a much kind of more grown-up or a newer attitude to pink. So moving on from that kind of very sweet kind of pastel-y millennial pinks that we've seen and out of some of those brasher, more bolder tones. So here we see quite a feminine colour palette, given a real luxurious finish and used with neutrals. So the silver ash and the sand are really nice neutrals within here. The cherry wood and the pink poplin that you see balance the retro out, and the kind of it moves between kind of very acidic and very kind of retro. So overall, it becomes very grown up, very elegant. And again, I think it's a really nice way to think about working with some of the more feminine colours within the palette. So this yellow, so Williams yellow, or yellow in general, is really important. So from this point, kind of moving forward, we talk about yellow a lot at WGSN, particularly for Gen Z and younger consumers. So millennials had pink, and Gen Z have yellow, and we see it being used across categories, and it's really set to gain a lot of prominence within the market. So originally, when we thought of Gen Z yellow, it was very bold, it was very bright, but there are lots of variations within the yellows that appeal to people. So we can see it coming through in much more kind of interesting and diverse shades. This Williams yellow that you see, it's almost like a softened lemon yellow, has a lot of kind of longevity to it. It's quite luminous, it's quite bright, it feels very fresh, and it moves really nicely within this colour palette because it becomes very bright when you play it with some of the brighter tones, or when you work it against some of these rich dark browns and deeper shades, it becomes really sumptuous and quite luxurious. So it's a great one to play with, and in particular the combination of this, using it alongside the butternut or alongside that deep dark kind of pine cone brown, shows you that versatility within it. So this is again a really lovely combination. Feels very retro, very comforting, but still has that freshness to it. Okay, so this is our last trend. And it's called light magic. So light magic is driven because we live in this era that's driven by data, by rationality. So we are seeing a growing interest in things that are much more kind of mystical and much more emotional. So our views on nature, including human nature, will really start to shift as we move forward. So this story is about exploring the swing back towards the mystical and the unexplainable. So there's a bit of a focus on quite dark, romantic looks in here. It's got a kind of gothic element running through it. And the designs that you see within this trend will move in kind of two directions. So one is quite kind of earthy and free-flowing, and the other is quite kind of structured and monastic, with really simple silhouettes that save a lot of the drama for the detailing and for the colour. So the first look within this is quite dramatic. I know, the dark dandy looks quite scary at first. But again, tailoring appears in all three of our trends, and we don't see the kind of importance of tailoring disappearing. We've lived in this world so driven by athleisure and comfort wear for so long that people are really starting to want to sharpen up the way that they dress. So the separates that we see within this trend have these kind of dandy-inspired flourishes, so things like patches or all-over embellishments, quite disruptive kind of fabric inserts as well. So the focus here is on kind of upending tailored designs with a sense of exuberance and fun. I know this doesn't look particularly like joyful and fun, but it's quite playful in its kind of breakdown of traditional suiting or traditional tailoring. So things like badges and patches coming through, appealing to a younger customer in particular. But even thinking about kind of unexpected placements or unexpected trims and fabric inserts for something that can become a little bit more kind of sophisticated and has this kind of quite strong deconstructed feel. And as I mentioned at the start, this trend has a lot of influence from the mystical and the emotional. And so with that, we get this quite spiritual, kind of decadent mood emerging. So there's a lot of combining quite ancient icons of mythology, paganism, even kind of witchcraft-like looks coming through. So a lot of the kind of prints, patterns, embellishments that we see reference things like the sun and the moon, even kind of more mythical creatures or talisman-like charms coming through. This is really prominent within kind of details, but also in things like accessories, jewellery, footwear, which can all feature kind of heavy embroidery, beading, and quite figurative decorations. So this is a nice one to move on. Some of the more kind of, we've seen a lot of kind of body part motifs in trends at the moment, so this is a nice move on for them to make them feel slightly more kind of mystical and magical. And Light Magic really does see the dress category reclaim a lot of femininity. As I said, we do live in this kind of comfort-driven world, and we're seeing a swing back to things that are a little bit more feminine or more structured. And what we see here is this structured hourglass shape becoming key. So it's about playing up the femininity of this style with floral prints, with fabrics like lace and velvet, so very kind of decadent decorations. Focus on structured shoulders, like you see in the center image here, using quite soft shoulder pads to exaggerate the silhouette even further, so really enhancing the feminine form. And we see this kind of shape working really well in both midi lengths for something more kind of wearable, or in full length maxi dresses, and maxi lengths for something much more kind of glamorous, and kind of that dark night feel. Tie the knot. So we've seen knotting, tying details for a while, and what we'll see here is a return to something a little bit more glamorous with that. Again, this trend is quite feminine, although it is quite dark and mystical. It is quite glamorous and quite feminine. So the knots that we see here give a lot of easy elegance to items, and quite simple items if you look at them. So you can use this detail on blouses, around necklines, on jackets as a new way of tying. Again, the tie detail here really helps to enhance the feminine form as well. So it makes it feel very kind of glamorous in an easy way. So we see a lot of ties around the waist, around the neckline. And this story is all about manipulating the fabric. So very fluid materials like wovens and satins work best. Again, signalling the kind of return to glamour. It looks very effortless, so keep that in mind as well. So it's about the other details are stripped back, so there's not an over-the-top amount of print or anything else used in there. It's all about kind of minimalist glamour. And the kind of opposite of that is these fluted flourishes. So simple details that can make a really big impact are key throughout Light Magic. For autumn-winter 1920, what we're seeing are lots of fluted ruffles and frills updating items. So giving things an appeal that is both sophisticated but also quite quirky at the same time. So these fluted kind of frills and ruffles feel much more dramatic when they're placed on collars or on cuffs, and on collars, and then they're much more commercial when they're used along cuffs. So these can be done in lots and lots of different ways, whether it's just simple kind of gathering and ribbing, right through to more kind of extravagant pleating. But we are seeing these used across product categories, from dresses to blouses, even into knitwear as well. And then fairy tale nature. So a lot of kind of supernatural, quite kind of romantic or forest-like themes come through here, and it gives everything this kind of whimsical, organic look. So lots of kind of inspiration from flora and fauna, and figurative shapes become quite decorative within that. So we're seeing either unusual materials being used to give this close to nature feel. So you can see here these kind of shell earrings make things feel natural very quickly, but still feel quite mystical because of the finish. But there's a lot of fluidity within this, so particularly for accessories and embellishments, we're seeing very fluid shapes and very kind of organic, natural shapes coming through, and quite extreme kind of fantastical nature prints and motifs. The Alexander McQueen shoe in the front that you see there is the most kind of dramatic version of this, where it really mimics nature, but you can see how you can have the same effect with a print and graphic and your choice of colour. And the last bit here is around crystals. So crystals return as a really important material, and particularly crystals that feel very natural or organic. So healing crystals are really picking up a lot of interest in the market. People are much more interested in crystals' ability to heal, or in their kind of wellness and self-care routines. So what we're seeing are these much more kind of ethereal, natural crystals being used as decorative coverings or feature embellishments. The most important ones are the ones that kind of capture colours, and they give things that kind of more mystical fairy tale mood. So whether that is taken straight from nature where it uses a lot of colour, or it's these glass-like finishes and crystal-like finishes that can reflect light and colour in unusual ways. But again, we see this as a key detail and a key kind of embellishment detail for the light magic trend. Okay, so lastly, I'm just going to run through the colours for light magic. So the light magic palette is very, very interesting because what's important here is the contrast. So we're seeing brights and darks being used together quite heavily, and that means that the neutrals appear quite muted. In here, you've got some really lovely kind of gem tones, so these kind of crystal-like or sharp gem tones that have an otherworldly appeal to them quite naturally. So things like the moonstone violet, the Himalayan salt pink towards the middle, the blue zircon as well. They have this kind of natural material, natural mineral crystal feel to them. You've got some really interesting near blacks, so I don't know, they probably look quite black on the screen, but here you've got this kind of really deep obsidian, the black ivy, which is a really beautiful dark green, and then the nightfall on the end, which is a really inky deep dark blue. And this kind of gives you that kind of feeling of the forest at night time, that kind of magical, mystical, quite romantic element. What else is in here? We have some unusual colours because some colours are you would typically associate with a summer season. So you've got things like this bitter absinthe colour, which is quite a poppy kind of limey tone, and then the bright blue kind of lightning colour beside it. So this quite a bright teal blue, again typically associated with a summer season, but it's nice to see them move through into a winter. So this first combination, you can see it's got that kind of ethereal, kind of interesting, kind of magical quality to it. And it's about using these quite clashing tones to give a real sense of energy. So we're seeing it's an update for a lot of the kind of iridescent looks that we've seen and iridescent colour palettes. You've got the fire opal and the carnelian red, so the two reds kind of reacting against that moonstone violet and the blue zircon, and those alone give this kind of electric feel. And although none of these shades are kind of originally bright, light is kind of created by this interesting combination. The moonshine and the bitter absinthe, they are the kind of green tones. They really give this digital effect, and they bring in this kind of electric light element. So quite an unusual colour palette, and it's one of the most kind of directional ones that I think we have within light magic. And here we see the very, very dark side of the trend. So this probably all looks the same colour for you guys, but it's about these rich darks being celebrated. And we are seeing a lot of kind of shadowy tones or tones that used to be core colours moving into fashion colours. So we're definitely already seeing browns become a fashion colour, moving out of the core palette. So this is about how you can use the very dark tones together to highlight the brighter colours. So that Himalayan salt becomes really fresh, and the dew as well, the kind of really pale grey, they become really fresh kind of breaths of air, and you can create a lot of drama and light between them. The green, the moonshine that you see, brings in that otherworldly quality, and it just keeps a little bit more of a contemporary feel to these dark shades. And the greens, so greens are really key within the light magic story, and it's about tones here being layered up and contrasted. So again, this is great for kind of tone-on-tone use.